Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg confirmed today that he and his wife had been privately recommending new hires to the Pete Buttigieg campaign. Zuckerberg confirmed the story, which was first reported by Bloomberg News at the end of a conference call about election security on Monday. He told CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe that the recommendations were not a sign of official support.
This shouldn't be taken as an endorsement. We have several mutual friends from college who introduced me to Pete a number of years ago. I did a Facebook Live event a couple of years back, so it's kind of widely known that I had met him. And when a number of colleagues who I'd worked with at Facebook or my philanthropic foundation were interested in working there, they asked me or my wife Priscilla to send over their resume, and so I did that. I think that this probably should not be misconstrued as if I'm deeply involved in trying to support their campaign or something like that.
Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of Facebook's biggest critics during this election, was asked about the story after a town hall in Des Moines. She opted to criticize Zuckerberg, but not Buttigieg.
My views on Mark Zuckerberg are pretty clear. He runs a company that has too much political power. They already have way too much influence in Washington, and they are helping drive every conversation in a way that will protect Mark Zuckerberg and his company, but that undermines our democracy. This is why I have said I think it's time to enforce the antitrust laws that are already on the book. We need to break up these big tech companies. We need to restore democracy in this country. We need a little more competition in these markets, and I think we can do it.
CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey Burns was at that Elizabeth Warren event. She joins me now from an apple orchard in Cambridge, Iowa. Hello to you, Caitlin. What questions does this Facebook connection raise for Pete Buttigieg?
Well, the Buttigieg campaign says that these recommendations were unsolicited, but they come at a time that, look, Democrats have really fallen out of love with big tech. When you look back just a decade or so ago, you can see kind of how this has come about, and especially someone like Elizabeth Warren, who has been going after big tech, has a plan to break up big tech, and uses Facebook as a way to tell that story and to explain her policy towards that. So it certainly creates an opening for potential attacks. It's interesting you didn't hear her mention Buttigieg by name, but instead use this opportunity to talk about her one of her signature plans.
And what does that tell us, Caitlin, about her strategy in dealing with this issue, the fact that she didn't go after Pete Buttigieg by name?
We've seen this a lot from her, where she doesn't take the bait when asked about other candidates. She tries to keep it on her own campaign. She was asked earlier today at 2 about Hillary Clinton calling Tulsi Gabbard a Russian agent and really didn't want to engage on that at all. So her strategy has been just to keep the focus on her campaign and her policies while drawing contrast, sometimes subtly. But this does raise a question, especially here in Iowa, where we've seen Pete Buttigieg have an extensive ground game, a pretty robust ground game here in Iowa, and we've seen him on the rise, actually, in a new poll out today.
Right, and this poll, a new poll from Suffolk University, shows Buttigieg in third, ahead of, but within the margin of error, of Bernie Sanders. Now, this is just one poll, but how concerned is the Sanders campaign about its standing in the first caucus state?
Well, it was interesting to watch how Pete Buttigieg acted in the last debate. You could see him trying to get into a more moderate lane in this primary and perhaps sensing some opportunity to take some support maybe from Joe Biden's supporters in a state like Iowa. He has been on the ground here for a while. He's campaigned here a lot. And when we talk to voters here, they often bring him up as someone that they're interested in. So he certainly is someone that is competitive here, or could be competitive here. And Bernie Sanders will be in Iowa later this week. Of course, he's coming off of that big New York City rally where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez endorsed him. He is trying to make the case that he is not only back on the campaign trail, but back with some vigor and some support from members of the new kind of party base.
Well, it's interesting. The landscape looks quite different, Caitlin, when you include undecided voters in that poll. 29% have still not made up their mind. So is there still room for any of these candidates to grow their support and win the caucuses?
Yeah, and we've heard that from voters here, too. Some people have made up their minds, but other voters we talked to named, 3 or 4 people that they were still considering. Actually, one voter we talked to yesterday said that he'll probably make the decision closer to the actual caucus, so about 100 days from now. And this is what some of the other candidates who aren't polling at the top as high as Biden or Warren or even Sanders are. They say that, look, they have time, that there are undecided voters, and they believe that there is time, especially in a place like Iowa where ground game, where human interaction really matters. They often point to former President Obama kind of coming from behind to win the caucus here. But remember, they just want to be competitive in Iowa because they want to get delegates. They don't necessarily have to win it outright, although that does certainly give them necessary momentum.
Right. Well, turning back to Senator Elizabeth Warren, she said she will release details on how she'll fund her universal health care plan. What do we know about why that plan is coming now?
Well, I think we have to look at what has happened over the past several days. So last week in Columbus at the debate, she was pressed repeatedly about whether her plan would include tax increases for the middle class, and she really didn't want to say so. She said that she's more focused on the overall costs and said costs won't go up for middle class families. But she has received a lot of pressure from other campaigns, namely Amy Klobuchar, who was in the state yesterday and through the weekend on a bus tour trying to capitalize on her debate performance, and Mayor Buttigieg, who had been going after Warren on the debate stage. So there has been this pressure building, and it's put her in a spot where we know that she has a lot of plans, but she has said before that Medicare for All, Bernie Sanders' plan, was something that she supported. So it kind of put her in a spot where she was supportive of that plan, but was you could tell kind of concerned about saying outright and having kind of a ready-made ad for opponents and for Republicans to talk about any potential tax increases. So she says a plan is forthcoming, and we'll wait to see whether what that looks like and whether that satisfies some of those critics.
Well, you asked Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar about the issue of health care. Let's play some of that clip.
Implementing any changes on health care, as you know, is very difficult. So while the party is debating kind of Medicare for all versus Medicare for more, Medicare for all who want it, public option, how can you actually get any kind of change done? I mean, you talk about being practical. How is that even possible? Even the bare minimum kind of changes, like a public option.
Yeah, well, I know I can do it. I've passed over 100 bills where I'm the lead Democrat. And yes, I've done work with Republicans, and I've also led the ticket to victory time and time again where Democrats win. And I think the way you do it is by, first of all, finding those things where there is common ground. That's why I'm so interested in building a coalition of our fired-up base and independents and moderate Republicans to say, nope, this is not what we want to do, Donald Trump. We actually want to make it easier for families to afford child care. We don't want to have a president that's out selling his business and selling himself and trying to get political gain over our country's gain. That's a case that I'm going to make all across the country, because you don't just want to win, you want to win big.
So, Caitlin, walk us through how the senator sees her campaign reaching the nomination, let alone winning the election with a big margin.
Yeah, I think her campaign is emblematic of this trend that we've seen over the past week or so, where more moderate members of the party are trying to strike back at the forces that are represented by Elizabeth Warren, who has been consistently gaining ground, especially in the early states of Iowa and New Hampshire. And so her strategy here is to kind of be the person that can be perhaps the fallback for those who were supporting Joe Biden, who are interested in looking elsewhere. When we were at an event of hers yesterday, we talked to voters who were interested in her, interested in Pete Buttigieg, and, kind of mentioned Joe Biden. And so she's trying to be that kind of moderate force and kind of campaigning as the senator next door, because she obviously comes from across the border in Minnesota. So we'll see if that gains traction. She's certainly trying to capitalize on that. And it's interesting to see candidates like her try to seize an opening, especially as someone like Elizabeth Warren continues to gain traction.
Before we move on, Caitlin, I want to look at cash on hand. The Biden campaign is in 5th place and is now fundraising off its financial struggles. An email to supporters says it would, quote, be a real shame if other candidates won the primary because they had more money to spend. How worried should the Biden campaign be about its financial standing?
Yeah, 'tis the season for campaign finance gimmicks, right? We saw Julian Castro present some sense of urgency about his campaign trying to raise money. The Biden campaign, though, those cash on hand numbers, when you compare them to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders especially, are pretty stark. There seems to be, high spending of that campaign, especially since the Biden campaign has done a lot of finance events. And so I think this is something that the campaign will have to contend with and raises questions about viability. However, they believe that they have invested, early in these states with a ground game with staff, and we'll see Biden actually in the state in Iowa later this week.
All right, Caitlin Huey Burns in Iowa. Caitlin, thank you very much.
Thank you.